first started thinking about joining the CIA when I was in graduate school, I thought it was a good opportunity to serve my country and also do really interesting, exciting work. I was just an analyst who sat in a cubicle in Northern Virginia writing papers for the president. And I was put into an extraordinary circumstance that really shaped the trajectory of my life.
Let's talk a little bit about Jack Ryan.
Sure. Jack Ryan is a fictional character, but when he's done right, he can illuminate certain truths to how intelligence is done. This is a guy who is an analyst. He's an American everyman who knows how to talk to senior policymakers on very complicated topics. And that's what he's trained to do. And then he's put into these increasingly bizarre or dangerous situations. And that's an interesting sort of dichotomy.
What about you? What's your story, Doctor? Oh, I'm an analyst. No shit.
Being an analyst isn't the sexiest part of CIA. It's not the place where a lot of people get their movies made. But it is critical because we are the glue that bring all these different intelligence capabilities of the United States together. So the real Jack Ryan is somebody who would be kind of like me, who used what was between my ears instead of pulling a trigger or jumping out of a helicopter. Before 9/11, counterterrorism was a bit of a sideshow. After 9/11, we reoriented our entire national security apparatus because we were ramping up not only for a war in Afghanistan, we also had a war in Iraq, and I was one of those people who was in that sort of post-9/11 hiring surge. Every terrorist group turns out propaganda. When I was an analyst, my assignment was to look at every single video that Al-Qaeda in Iraq had turned out. We wanted to see whether there was any larger strategy to this media campaign. Now you can fast forward to what ISIS does. So much more sophisticated. There was this powerful recruitment video that looks just like a first-person shooter video game in the Middle East. It's exciting, there's fires, there's explosions, there's gunfire, people running around. See, hear that? Heavy breathing is actually what happens right before you die in a bunch of video games. And this is the end if you actually get killed in a video game. They are packaging it in such a way that appeals to most Americans, most Westerners, most men can easily identify with. And they say, wow, that was exciting, even if these guys are the bad guys. Being at the agency also means you can't really talk about what you do for a living. It's oftentimes you start hanging out with a lot of folks who are your colleagues. They understand what the pressures that you're feeling at any given moment.
Welcome to the International Spy Museum.
Tara Mahler is a former colleague of mine. She worked on intelligence in Iraq. We went to the Spy Museum in downtown DC.
This is mostly hidden weaponry. We have an assassination weapon in a cigarette pack.
That's fun, a rectal toolkit. That's a lot of stuff that you can put in a very sensitive place. The Spy Museum shows that the second oldest profession in the world has really morphed, but the rationale for its existence hasn't really changed.
The Hollywood trope about the CIA that annoys us the most as analysts is that we're out in the field using all sorts of equipment and tools like this, but there's a lot of, I guess you could say, brain power behind the CIA also.
Yeah.
But most people don't really know what the PDB briefer does, which is the president's daily briefer, who's briefing the president every single morning about events all over the world, which is really critical to our nation's security.
Giving analysis and not policy guidance is critical to the overall health of the intelligence community because ultimately it's the President of the United States and people around him who make the decisions for better or for worse for this country. I was working on Iraq counterterrorism issues, and an opportunity presented itself to go to Baghdad. Like the new Jack Ryan, I was just an analyst. I was put into an extraordinary circumstance in a very difficult time in American foreign policy. We were rocketed every day, we were mortared every day. You're still working in an office. It's just a little more lethal. By 2004, 2005, the war had really turned into a kind of an ugly occupation. It looked like the whole country was completely coming apart. I happened to show up at a time that there was a real interest on the part of certain insurgent groups to partner, at least temporarily, with the United States to fight an even worse insurgency, which at the time was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I did get to meet a number of these insurgent leaders. And the interesting thing about these guys is that they look like men in their 40s, guys wearing sweater vests, mustaches, just seriously regular people, somebody's uncle. So it's interesting, you're sitting there having tea with these individuals and little cupcakes and cookies and stuff like that. But you knew that these guys would probably love to cut your throat under other circumstances. If you only talk to friends, you're never really going to get very far. You have to touch the darkness sometimes. Every so often, because it's Iraq, the electricity was pretty spotty, and so every so often, the electricity would go down, and we'd be plunged in pitch darkness. In the movies, somebody would get shot or some terrible thing, and then the lights would come back on. So the lights went out, we couldn't see anything, and then the lights came back on again. And all these Iraqi insurgents kind of like looked around, and they said, okay, we're all here, and so everything's fine. And so we'd continue talking, and then a couple minutes later, we'd be plunged into pitch black again. Found out later that these guys, all of them assumed we were going to jump them. And we could have done it, by the way. We just didn't, because the point was to convince their insurgent groups to stop shooting at us. After a while, they trusted us, we trusted them, and they took the rod to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I left the CIA actually out of love.
You did.
I remember when I came back from Iraq and I showed up at the airport, I was actually going to meet my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife. She was made up so beautifully, and then she saw me and she burst into tears, and her mascara kind of like rolled down her face as she cried. And you realize that there are all these political things floating around you and all these big national security issues, but what really matters to you as a person is the personal.
Have a great day.
Yeah.
Bye, Daddy.
There's a lot of data out there that people can exploit to hurt all of us. So I'm the director of intelligence solutions at a cybersecurity firm called Fordless Solutions. The core part of being an analyst is helping people make the best decisions possible based on actionable intelligence. And in the private industry, you try to also help people make the best choices available to protect themselves in cyberspace. So what we're here to do is to determine what are the vulnerabilities for this client, both online and in the real world, for the risk of kidnapping. The thing about terrorism is that it creates fear. So you can do certain things on the internet to create fear and uncertainty and panic in any society. Fighting terrorism is the most important thing that the United States actually does in the national security sphere. Now pushing into the second decade of the conflict, cybersecurity issues are very, very important, but the ability to protect every single American and every single American interest and those of our allies remains extremely challenging.